Okay,
Professor, are you going to talk about the pulmonary ventilation?
that's what I'm talking about.
You already talked about it the other day.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the one at rest and when you inhale and when you exhale.
You're right,
Yeah,
but I didn't tell you all the muscles.
okay.
Uh-oh, no, not this. Okay, diaphragm. Okay, so as she observed, we talked about this. So what happens? So this is just at rest. You're not taking a breath. What's true about atmospheric pressure and pressure inside of the lungs?
They're the same.
Yes. Okay. So okay. Inhalation, diaphragm does what?
Contracts.
Yeah, and it flattens. Okay, so this flattens. So that's gonna pull down. Okay, external intercostals contract, which elevates your ribs. So we're gonna expand the thoracic cavity. So because pressure of a gas is inversely proportional to the volume in your thoracic cavity increases, which is going to increase the volume of the lungs because they're moving along with it, or increased lung volume. What's true about pressure inside of your lungs as compared to atmospheric pressure?
It should be lower.
Yes, it's lower. So when that happens, air just rushes in like a vacuum. Now, the diaphragm relaxes, so it goes back up. External intercostals relax, so your rib cage decreases or drops back down. So volume of your thoracic cavity just decreased, volume of the lungs decreases. What does that do to pressure? What's pressure like inside your lungs compared to outside? Up. So that pushes air out. So that's just quiet breathing. Now we have forced inhalation. So labored breathing. Perhaps you did exercise, you're stressed out, whatever the case is. You have disease, disorder. Okay. Now we're going to have some additional muscles are recruited, kick in. So forced inhalation additional muscles are going to expand the volume of the thoracic cage. Additional muscles contract. Let's take a look at these additional muscles. Okay. All right, so we have some additional muscles that are going to kick in. Uh-oh. Okay, so they're going to just basically increase the volume all the way around. don't worry about which ones increase height, increase depth, because they all kind of do that. So we need an increase in volume of the thoracic cavity, which increases lung volume, which decreases pressure, so more air can come in. So the only muscles I'm going with on the list are going to be your scalenes, all three, sternocleidomastoid, pectoralis minor, and serratus anterior. Because all these muscles will pec minor, scalenes, and serratus anterior all attach to the ribs and pull on the ribs. Serratus posterior superior is on your back, it's deep. That's going to pull on the ribs as well. Let's have a look at these muscles real quick. Okay. Well, here we have the prime. Come on, you piece. We have the prime movers. Okay, for quiet breathing. Diaphragm. Okay. Okay. Let's muscle up here. External intercostals. The origin is on the inferior border of a rib above, insertion, superior border of a rib below. When they contract, they elevate the rib cage. So quiet breathing, contraction of the diaphragm, external intercostals. When they relax, exhale. No additional muscles required. Okay, so forced inhalation. Here's our additional muscles. Okay, the scalenes. We have anterior, middle, and posterior scalene. You can see how they attach to ribs 1 and 2. So they'll pull on those ribs and elevate them. Okay. Sternocleidomastoid. Pulls on the manubrium, so it pulls your sternum up and out. Clavicle. Pectoralis minor. Okay. Its origin is supposed to be ribs 3 through 5, insertion, coracoid process, but with your scapula fixed, meaning your scapula doesn't move, the origin insertion can switch. With the scapula stable, now pec minor contracts and pulls on ribs 3 through 5 and pulls them out. Serratus anterior attached to ribs 1 through 8 and the entire vertebral border of the scapula. Scapula stays still. Serratus anterior will pull on ribs through 8 and pull your rib cage out. So that's serratus anterior. Finally, let's look at a muscle you haven't looked at, which is serratus posterior superior. It's deep. So here's rhomboid minor, rhomboid major, levator scapulae. Serratus posterior superior is here. It's deep to the rhomboid. So let's go down a layer of muscles, and now I have serratus posterior superior. There it is. So if we look at it, you can see how it's attached to some ribs. So it'll pull the ribs out. So these are accessory muscles of inhalation. So taking a really deep breath, that's forced inhalation. So are you cool with serratus posterior superior? Now there's a serratus posterior superior. What might there also be?
Inferior?
Yeah, serratus posterior inferior. Okay. So there we have it. These are the muscles, accessory muscles that are kick in for a deep breath, pull up and out, increase thoracic volume. Now, normally exhalation is just accomplished by relaxation of the diaphragm and the external intercostals. However, should you need to forcibly exhale a little more air, we're going to have some muscles that kick in for this. Okay. Pull down and in, internal intercostals engage. Now your internal intercostals fire off, and they have the opposite origin insertion. Okay, internal intercostals, their origin is on the superior border of a rib below, and they insert on the rib above, so they pull your ribs down. Okay, you have this weird muscle called transversus thoracis. It's actually located in the front of your thoracic cage, but it's inside your ribs. So we'll look at that, transversus thoracis. And serratus posterior inferior. So all of these will pull your rib cage, decrease the volume of your thoracic cage. Additionally, there's some muscles that will put pressure on the underside of your diaphragm and push your diaphragm up even more. Push that diaphragm up and push that air out, decrease thoracic volume. All your abdominal muscles, all your ab muscles, they contract. That's going to increase the pressure in your abdominal cavity, increase intra-abdominal pressure, which is going to push on the diaphragm.
So exhaling, when you exhale, you're pulling downward and inward?
Well, your thoracic, that pulls down, these muscles pull down and in on your thoracic cage. So
Okay.
It says pull down and in, I'm talking about your thoracic cage.
Oh, this is for accessory muscle usage.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. The diaphragm gets pushed up hard by increased intra-abdominal pressure exerted by the abdominal muscles contracting. Mostly transversus abdominis, external and internal obliques, rectus abdominis to a lesser degree. So that's why an arrow is pushing up, bam, pushing up on the diaphragm. So we'll leave it at that. So the effect is decreased thoracic volume, decreased pressure, so air gets pushed out even more. So let's look at these muscles real quick. You know internal intercostals and you know the abdominal muscles. You don't know transversus thoracis or serratus posterior inferior. I'm pretty sure I pulled transversus thoracis from the list. So let's have a look at these. Okay. Well, here's serratus posterior inferior right there. It's a deep muscle as well. It's going to be superficial to the rector spinae, but deep to latissimus dorsi. Anterior view, lateral view, posterior view. Serratus posterior inferior. So clearly it's going to pull on ribs, what, 12, 11, 10, and 9. Pull them down. Transversus thoracis, you can't even see it. Well, here we have transversus abdominis, just basically all your abdominal muscles collectively, all of them will compress on your abdomen and increase pressure. Now I can see transversus thoracis, it's here. So it's gonna pull on your ribs and decrease your thoracic cage volume. That's transversus thoracis. It's a thin, almost worthless muscle, but it's used as an accessory muscle in forced exhalation. So your abs, transversus thoracis, and serratus posterior inferior. And that should be it. Okay, so you want to know the difference between quiet breathing, which muscles engage, and labored breathing, forced inhalation and exhalation, which muscles engage.
And the first slide was quiet breathing, right?
Yeah, I didn't even do a slide for quiet breathing. I just drew it for you. This is forced inhalation, forced exhalation.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thoracic volume changes is what drives ventilation, pressure. Okay. Passive ventilation, only the diaphragm and external intercostals. Forced inhalation recruits a suite of additional muscles that expand thoracic cage volume. Forced exhalation, additional muscles contract that decrease thoracic volume, down and in. So it's pretty interesting. 1052, what else do we need to look at? So there's that. Oh yeah, I know. Your life wouldn't be complete without a little nervous system in it. Okay, the big picture. Get oxygen in your bloodstream and CO2 out. That's the point. Okay. Well, here's some muscles. Let's see if my list is good. All your abdominal muscles. Erector spinae, let's ignore them. It's confusing. We can add serratus anterior to the list of muscles of forced inhalation. Okay, so basically your breathing rate is set by the ventral respiratory group. That's your important key respiratory center, and that's located in the medulla oblongata. So the VRG, ventral respiratory group, sets your breathing rate. So in the medulla oblongata, you have the VRG. There's also the pontine respiratory group in the pons. So the pontine respiratory group works with a respiratory center in the medulla. All right. So the ventral respiratory group, it's just rhythm generators. The output drives respiration. So here's the VRG sending out signals, okay, stimulating the phrenic nerve, which causes diaphragm contractions, and the intercostal nerves to stimulate the external intercostals. There's also a dorsal respiratory group, which receives sensory input, and it'll modify your breathing rate, smooth it out, slight adjustments. Modifies. The pontine respiratory group interacts to smooth your respiratory pattern. So you have the pontine respiratory center and the ventral respiratory group and the dorsal respiratory group, controlling your breathing rate. The dorsal respiratory group just integrates sensory information. What sort of sensory information can you receive? It's like this. You have respiratory centers. So here's the two. You have the aortic bodies are located in the aortic arch. And you have the carotid bodies, which are located at the junction of the internal and external carotid artery. What these are is chemoreceptors. They detect blood pH. Blood pH will tell your body what oxygen levels are like. Basically, if there's too much carbon dioxide, CO2 reacts with water and makes carbonic acid, which will decrease pH, so these chemoreceptors can pick up on carbon dioxide levels. Or you could think of them as oxygen sensors, but not quite. Okay, so you have these peripheral chemoreceptors, the carotid body, right here in between external and internal carotid artery, and you have aortic bodies and aortic arch. Basically, they're sensing, picking up on what oxygen levels are like in blood heading out the systemic circuit. So as blood's ejected out the left ventricle, moves through the aortic arch, the aortic bodies pick up on what the oxygen content's like. Also, blood being sent up to your brain better have a lot of oxygen in it. So the carotid bodies are picking up on what blood's like going to your brain. This is important. There's also central chemoreceptors are located in the medulla oblongata itself. They're actually sampling the cerebral spinal fluid to see what oxygen levels are like. So the medulla has little sensors to see what oxygen levels like in the cerebral spinal fluid. And these peripheral chemoreceptors are checking out what oxygen is like in your blood, being sent out the aorta and up the carotid arteries. Okay. So the aortic bodies are innervated by CN10, the vagus. The carotid bodies are innervated by CN9, the glossopharyngeal, mostly, and the vagus together. So carotid bodies are cranial nerve 9, glossopharyngeal, and the vagus innervates the aortic bodies. So this sensory information is relayed back. And the dorsal respiratory group kind of processes that information and then will adjust the ventral respiratory group's breathing rate. So it sets your breathing rate. So let's suppose you have low oxygen picked up by the medulla or by the aortic bodies or carotid bodies. What do you think that's going to do to your breathing rate? Increase it or decrease it? Low O2 detected.
Increase breathing.
Increase. The VRG will increase the breathing rate. And there it is. So your respiratory rate is set by the medulla, the ventral respiratory group. The pontine respiratory center smooths it out. The DRG, dorsal respiratory group, integrates sensory information coming in from the aortic bodies, carotid bodies, things like that. And the medulla itself will sample the cerebral spinal fluid for oxygen content. So that's how your breathing is controlled automatically. So you yourself, you can voluntarily take a deep breath and exhale forcibly and recruit those additional muscles. However, just quiet, passive breathing, or your breathing rate needs to increase, Okay, automatic.
So if you damage your medulla, your breathing is pretty compromised.
If your medulla is damaged, you're done. Yeah. So yeah, that's the medulla controls your heart rate and your breathing rate.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no medulla, game over. Our cerebral hemispheres, that's like the last part of the brain to have developed in evolution. The medulla is ancient. So you go back to, I guess, animals that have less of a cerebral cortex, smaller cerebral hemispheres, they all have the brainstem.
Wow.
Okay, so that's it for respiration.